Great.
I'm just starting this. I just got held up with another call. Couldn't get off that.
Hi, Kartik.
Hi, Beth. How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
We're doing well. Yeah.
Good. Good to see you.
Yeah. Good to see you both. And this looks like an interesting webinar.
Let's hope so.
We're used to the sandwich generation, actually. We've
Yes,
been
yes, we'll
living
talk
like this
about
for
that.
generations.
Yes, yes.
It's
Yeah.
much more of a novelty here.
Right. Okay. So, should we get going?
Absolutely. We are ready whenever you are.
All right. Okay, let me start. Welcome, everybody. This is the second webinar from Harula and Beth, which is an interesting subject, the sandwich generation. I think they'll be able to tell you more about that than I will. So I'll let Harula start off with that. Harula?
Sure. Thank you, Kartik.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Harula, and I'm one of the directors of the Ontario College of Homeopathic Medicine. I am thrilled to be presenting with my colleague Beth Landau-Halpern, who is the head of homeopathy at our awesome college. We are very proud of OCHM as a school. We are presenting the most robust and in-depth homeopathic education available in Canada. And we work with students from across the country and internationally graduating homeopaths of distinction. Of course, the student clinic is where the philosophical aspect of homeopathic medicine and health sciences are consolidated, and where we are able to treat patients and change their lives, really. In today's discussion, we will be examining the homeopathic approach to the sandwich generation. And this talk is both for the public as well as homeopathic practitioners, so that we can ultimately provide our patients and empower them with the information they require to live a life that is thriving. And of course, for the homeopaths to be able to provide them with more tools to help their patients on a very deep level achieve that health that they so desire. The sandwich generation, therefore, is not a generation per se, and we'll talk about this, but more a state of patients where the this generation is one where we have the ability to, or are put in a position to, take care of our children as well as our aging parents. This family situation is especially prominent in the West, where multi-generational households are few and far between. The family support systems are simply not part of our environment in the West. And so this generation finds itself in a particular predicament. There are many responsibilities and obligations to juggle, including work and raising young children, helping the elderly parents thrive, as well as having financial obligations to both generations, as well as personal financial obligations, dealing with relationships in a healthy manner, and ultimately taking care of ourselves, because that's something that is often forgotten while we take care of others. Now, the sandwich generation, is one that comes with a lot of stress for many people, as well as challenging circumstances that we are faced with. And therefore, we need to be able to come up with some sort of solutions, especially as homeopaths, to help our patients because they're feeling tight and squeezed. This term came into our lexicon about 30 to 40 years ago, and it was first conceived by social workers and geriatric specialists, and it was referring to people in the childbearing years and maybe a little older who had several responsibilities. So the responsibilities include taking care of their own children, as well as their elderly parents who need assistance, But not only, it's not just taking care of children and taking care of parents, it's juggling these responsibilities that life brings to us on a daily basis and the regular, including interpersonal relationships, including work, including finances. And this sandwich generation sort of came into play for many, many reasons. One of those is that the childbearing age for women has shifted. It used to be that women had children in their 20s. It used to be that, the expectations of a young woman were different from what they are today. And what we're seeing now is that the childbearing years have shifted to an older age. As those childbearing years are shifting to an older age, our parents are getting older and they are needing more assistance. The reasons are many that these childbearing years have shifted to an older age, and they include financial reasons, or educational. So we're going to talk about education as part of the milieu of a younger woman. She wants to become educated. That takes time. She wants to get a master's degree or a PhD or become a medical doctor or pursue a professional career. That all takes time. Following the studies, of course, she wants to get a great job and build her career, and that will delay the family situation. It will delay marriage in many cases. It will delay her having a child. And as a result, we're seeing this sort of sandwich generation who is a little bit older, taking care of younger children, as well as the elderly parents. Now, there aren't only downsides to this generation. Multi-generation households exist all over the world. But the stresses are real for this group of individuals who are sort of taking charge of many of life's circumstances and their family as a whole. We see that oftentimes. We talked about this in terms of the stresses of finances, but when we look after our parents and our elders, oftentimes it's not just the parents, it can be grandparents as well. We look at the financial situation because it's one that stresses this generation specifically. So we have to care for our elders, yes, but not only. There are legal issues that are often involved. There are housing issues that are often involved, estate and issues with their health. So, these elderly folks need assistance in more than just housing, say. Some of them need daily assistance with taking medication, with being fed, with being physically cared for, especially if there are disabilities that need to be taken into consideration. And we can't forget about the emotional aspects in any relationship either. Those are quite grand in older people. They need us. We need them. They need us. They need us to take care of them on many different levels. So what drives the situation? Oftentimes, what drives the situation is strictly economics. When this sandwich generation, we're getting a little bit older, and our parents are getting older, our grandparents as well, our children too. Oftentimes, our children are coming back from having studied abroad or having studied in a different city. The financial struggle is quite real in the West today, and in most of the world. These older children cannot afford to live on their own. It is simply the result of our society. It's very difficult for them to find solid jobs. It's very difficult for them to put down payments on homes, and oftentimes they end up moving back home and living with the parents. This cost of high living and finding sustainable work puts an interesting spin on the family dynamic. And now the parents who had thought, my children children are off, potentially they're married, those same children might actually be coming back into the household. And so we have older children coming in back again because of financial circumstances. We have this sandwich generation and the elders who are also potentially either close by or not, or moving into the house. And we have this multi-generational family situation. And that is what we're discussing today, because it can be quite a challenge for that group of individuals. About 50% of adults in their 40s and 50s have parents who are aged over 65 and who have various degrees of responsibility to them, as well as raising young children. So this is a huge part of the population. This is not a small subset. It's a huge part of the population. And from a financial perspective, they're spending about $10,000 a year taking care of their children as well as their aged parents. 1 in 8 of these individuals are taking care of parents who are unwell. They're taking care of siblings as well as grandparents. They also have to consider planning for their future and their state of health. And the emotional support that comes along with such responsibilities is very, very high. When we look at the research, we see that people are living longer, which is great, but this sandwich cohort will continue to grow as a result. In America, we're seeing that by the year 2030, which is in the next 10 years, there will be 70 million people in this sandwich generation cohort. The elderly parents are living longer. They themselves are living longer. And we, as caregivers of this generation, are experiencing the stress and the emotional upheaval that is associated with being part of this family dynamic. Now, there are certainly advantages to having multi-generational households, of course. When we look at from a young child's perspective into older adulthood, the young children have this incredible opportunity to get to know their grandparents and great-grandparents. It's a beautiful thing to watch. It's wonderful when this older generation is able to impart their wisdom on the young ones, and it's gorgeous because they learn so much from each other. The young children get to have playmates, and the elders also get to have company in raising those young children. But it's a challenge for the older folks in this elderly generation for many reasons. One, because they may not feel as useful as they had in the past because their health could be ailing. They may not feel as accomplished as they had in the past because their health may be ailing. And having this sort of stress between children not getting full attention from their parents, the elderly not being able to get full attention from their children, makes the situation slightly more challenging. In India, this multi-generational household situation is common, and the elders, the grandparents, take care of their children and support their children's children in growth and development. In Korea, we see that the sandwich generation is huge. It's the highest number of people than any other Asian country. The situation in Korea is slightly different because the cost of living is so high. There is a massive cost in caring for this older population. So the natural thing to do, of course, is to have them move in. In North America, the situation is completely different. There are nearly 3 million people, which is approximately 10%, slightly less than 10% of the population, who are caring for older parents. But what we see here is that because this multi-generational living situation is quite different, and it doesn't necessarily exist in Canada, oftentimes we live further away from our parents. So nearly 25% of this sandwich generation has to travel an hour or more to care for their family members. In the States, we see nearly 10 million adults that are caring for parents long distance. And it makes, again, it makes the dynamic between the parent and their child and the parent and their parents slightly challenging because no one is getting the full attention of this sandwich generation that is so needed. In Australia, the sandwich generation equates to 2.6 million unpaid caregivers. And when we look at the ups and downs, of course, this is one that changes in depending on the country that one is in. But let's look at this quote that says, 10 years ago, I would not have guessed my mother would live with us. We just didn't think about what was down the road. The experience is equal parts challenging and rewarding. On one hand, I'm juggling work with the needs of both my mom and my kids, and it's tough financially. On the flip side, my children are getting to know their grandma in a special way, while I'm getting to know my mom on a deeper level as well. And surely that is, that is the epitome of what the sandwich generation is feeling, that they can't they can't attain one specific goal, whether that goal is to raise your children a specific way or to care for your parents, to juggle all the responsibilities that are required of you. It is a challenging time, but it is also very rewarding for the many reasons that we had already discussed. For the children, the youngest children of these sandwich generation parents, we do see insufficient amounts of attention and assistance, or a lack of space because somebody else has moved into the home. They are often in a situation where they have to take care of themselves more than some of their friends do. And because there's stress with the parents of these young children, sometimes there's chaos in the house, or sometimes there's the stress and irritability. Like, oh, I can't be bothered to look at this assignment from my 5-year-old, for example, because I need to take care of my older parent. Similarly, in such a situation, we see that the elderly also have very specific concerns, and there's a downside to them in this situation too, and that is that maybe they're not getting the appropriate care they need. Maybe there's so much financial stress that it's causing anxiety for them. Maybe they feel helpless and unable to take care of themselves, which puts them in a position of feeling isolated and not wanted. There's a loss of autonomy for parents, elderly parents, who had previously been robust and strong. Imagine, this elderly population now having to rely on their children for assistance. It is surely stressful. And this is the epitome of what we see, the sandwich generation being pulled in many different directions and for many different reasons. And how can we be of assistance, and how can we offer strength? Well, this is a problem, as we said, mostly in the West, because we don't live in that multi-generational household that other countries are very much used to. This is an issue primarily for women because we take on the role of caregiver in society, by and large, and we have to make decisions that are difficult. Now, do we care for our elderly parents and ignore our children? Do we care for our children and ignore our elderly parents? That's not possible. One in this generation can't ignore either child or elderly parent while having other responsibilities to juggle as well. It just means that the responsibilities are many. We need to be able to juggle them in a way that is healthy for everyone, including oneself. And so the question is, how do we do that? You know, these women in particular not only have a lot on their plates, we also may be going through challenges ourselves physically. We're of a generation that may be nearing or is close to or in the middle of menopause. This creates a whole host of other issues in this dynamic. We have our own stresses, physically, mental, emotionally. We often burn out in situations like this. Being a caregiver is a challenge, and it can cause anxiety. It can cause feelings of guilt in the sandwich generation because they're feeling like everything they're doing is simply not enough. They're being pulled in many different directions, and this ultimately causes anxiety. It can cause feelings of isolation. It can cause depression. I mean, we are giving so much to our children, to our parents. There is no time physically for us. We feel unappreciated. We feel as though we are sacrificing our own selves for the benefit of our family members. Our interpersonal relationships are often ones that suffer because we're pulled in so many different directions. I mean, surely if we have no time for ourselves, how can we possibly make time for our spouses or our friends? And you know, self-care is a challenge. Time management is difficult. And this balance is one that we need to try and wrap our brains around. This is the epitome of the sandwich generation, and how do we survive that? So what happens to this generation of individuals then? Well, what happens is we keep going and we keep going and we do what we need to do, and we work from morning to night all day long. And then at some point, we collapse. We collapse because it just can't go any further. We wake up one morning and we are done. We are done with taking care of others. We are done with all of the responsibilities. And now we need help. So how do we get it? Who cares for the caregiver? That is an interesting challenge because it's difficult for a caregiver to elicit support and help from somebody else. So are there resources that a caregiver can lean on? How can this caregiver maintain their strength and resilience? This is a challenge. This is why we're talking about homeopathic approaches today. I mean, of course, there are things that we can do on a daily basis, like try to be kinder to ourselves and cut ourselves some slack. We need to take breaks and potentially, implement tools like mindful meditation. Of course, diet is very important, and nutritional foods will always help with the mental emotional strain. We need to be able to sleep properly so that our bodies can regenerate. Laughter and interpersonal relationships are always critical in any stressful situation. And that is, of course, the challenge of balancing all of these responsibilities. And yes, as homeopaths, we know we have so many tools that we can use to help our patients and ourselves. And this is what we will be discussing next. Beth?
Okay, hi. Thank you, Harula. That was a great introduction to what the issues surrounding this concept of the sandwich generation really are. And now I want to turn the discussion to where does homeopathy lie in this discussion? This conversation is not all that different from the last webinar that we offered on I Love Homeopathy, which was about stress in the COVID era. And really what we're talking about here is another form of extreme stress. And indeed, COVID has certainly made the plight and the complexity of people in the COVID era much more complicated, because not only are the caregivers taking care of elderly people and their children, but there's a lot more financial stress. Children are at home, they need to be homeschooled, and the elderly are often afraid to go out, afraid to get the health care they need. And so really in this COVID generation, where the stakes on the sandwich generation have just been cranked up and made higher and higher and higher. So I want to make it clear that while we do not only talk about stress and we do not only treat people with stress-related disorders, stress is unarguably a massive contributor to chronic and health concerns in current society. And obviously homeopathy is plays a huge role in addressing those kind of stress, because honestly, this is a place where mainstream medicine really has very little to offer. So what role does homeopathy have to play? What we're talking about here really is a circumstance. It's a set of a situation or a set of circumstances that are particular to a certain group of people. And while homeopathically we don't necessarily treat circumstances, Samuel Hahnemann in the Organon does touch on this idea of situational or circumstantial disorder. Aphorism 94 states, while inquiring into the state of a chronic disease, the particular circumstances of the patient with regard to his ordinary occupations, his usual mode of living and diet, his domestic situation, and so forth, must be well considered and scrutinized to ascertain what there is in them that may tend to produce or maintain disease, in order that by their removal, the recovery may be promoted. Excuse the typo in there, may be promoted. So what Hahnemann is talking about there are addressing the circumstances and the situations that maintain illness or cause illness, and what we can do to address those. Now, for people who have massive obligations both up and down the generational scale, there's not a lot they can do other than resort to homeopathy. I'm not talking about, I mean, they can't really kick their children out of the home. They can't really kick their elderly parents out of the home. They need to figure out ways of coping within a situation that has very little flexibility. So, of course, the homeopathic remedy in this sort of a situation is not selected solely on the circumstance or the situation, but the circumstance and the situation that the patient is functioning within is a huge part of the totality of symptoms and has to be taken into consideration. So when I work with students or in my own practice, working with cases that are largely mental emotional, I look at 4 essential factors to consider. So the first factor is the etiology, or the triggers or causative experiences that are significant in developing pathology. And that is exactly what we're talking about here, and what Hahnemann was talking about in the aphorism that I just read to you. In any given circumstance or situation in which there's a lot of commonality of experience, we can make a pretty good guess as to what some of these circumstances or situations might be, what this etiology or the triggers or the causative factors in the pathology might be. However, the other factors that are really important in essentially mental and emotional cases are much more difficult to ascertain. So look at those closely, but for the remainder of my discussion with you, I'm going to really be looking at this number 1, the etiology, the triggers, or the causative factors. So the other essential things to consider in mental emotional cases beyond causation our reaction. Now, the reaction to a set of causative situations is highly, highly individualized. And you can certainly see that given this concept of a sandwich generation, those people stuck in the middle of the sandwich can respond to the pressures around them in a multitude of ways. Some people can break down, some people get very angry, some people get very withdrawn and irritable, and I mean the number of possibilities are endless. And so and we can't really in our discussion here, project how people might respond to the situation. But it's an important factor for you as homeopaths to take on board when looking at a case. Concomitance is number 3, a third part of these essential elements in a mental emotional case. Concomitants are the accompanying physical pathology, which there may be some of or there may not be some of. And again, there's a myriad of possibilities, an endless number of options for how physical pathology can reflect internal turmoil. And the fourth factor I want to talk about is the central delusion, which is the narrative that patients tell themselves. For instance, and I'm just making this up here, the caregiver who is stuck in the middle of a situation where they're taking care of people older and younger than them and sacrificing their own professional development in the process, may have convinced themselves that they're in this situation because they're not worthy. They're in this situation and get no respect. They're in this situation and nobody understands them. These are all what I would call their central delusion. And again, we can't really guess what those might be for the individual because there are so many possibilities and options there. So I want to focus and consider for the rest of our discussion these causative triggers and develop a fake or a potential, almost a homeopathic case built around these causative factors. And again, just to make it really clear, if you are working with patients in this sort of a situation, you need to look at the causative factors, and we will look at those and we will look at remedies that are appropriate for that causative factor. But a good homeopath will also include the patient's reaction to those causative factors, concomitant, so the accompanying physical pathology, and the central delusion. So what I've done here is I've tried to come up with some rubrics that describe this etiology or the circumstances. And the ones that I feel are probably common, and of course, this too will have a lot of individuality and a lot of scope for a different sort of picture depending on the totality. But I think it fairly likely that we can assume that most patients will have ailments from cares and worries. They will have cares about their relatives. The idea of the maternal instinct exaggerated. That's the idea that their need to take care, their need to be mothering and caring is sort of extended and beyond normal bounds. They have anxiety about their children, and they also have anxiety about their family. Undoubtedly, people stuck in the middle of the sandwich generation are busy because they are juggling a lot of people. They may and often have too much of a sense of duty. They do not know how to limit their giving and what they feel responsible for. Enormous amount of love for their parents. Often a feeling of helplessness. Now, agreed, this rubric and the really the ones that remain are reactions, but I think they're probably common reactions for these circumstances. So a feeling of helplessness, that they're doing too much, they're overwhelmed, that they have anxiety about money matters, that they desire rest, and that they have ailments from excessive responsibility. So I repertorized these rubrics and came up with a number of remedies that look like Well, these are interesting remedies to consider for the circumstances we are talking about. So really circumstantial case here. The remedies that I want to draw your attention to are highlighted, and some of them are remedies that we spoke about in our last talk on stress. And then I have a number of remedies that I'd like to talk about after we talk about the more common remedies that may not be ones that immediately occur to you or remedies that you're necessarily familiar with. So we're going to take a quick look at Calcarea carbonicum, at carcinosinum, at cocculus, at sepia, at phosphoric aceticum, at aurum, and at caliphosphoricum. Ambrogresia I will talk about later on as one more unusual remedies. So we're going to take a quick whip through these more common remedies, most of which you're probably relatively familiar with, and then spend a little bit more time focusing on some of the remedies that are you're perhaps less familiar with, but would also be really well worth considering for the circumstances of people suffering in the midst of a sandwich generation. So carcinosinum is a great remedy for patients who have spent most of their lives or a large part of their lives taking care of others and fulfilling the expectations and needs of others. Carcinosinum people are people pleasers, and they're overly sympathetic and have often had a history of taking on too much responsibility from a very early age. These are patients with a huge amount of self-control who often suppress their own needs, their own desires for caring for others, looking out for others. There are patients who often have strong bonds with family, and they have an almost overwhelming sense of duty, which leads them to feel that nothing they do is ever enough or is ever good enough. They can be obsessively clean, obsessively orderly, obsessively fastidious, and obsessively giving. Symptoms are often chronic or prolonged insomnia. As we well know, patients who overextend themselves over a long period of time are people who often develop chronic diseases, and it's not surprising that patients needing carcinosinum are often come from families with either a familial or a personal history of cancer, diabetes, repeated febrile episodes is less opposite, and childhood less obvious, and childhood infectious diseases occurring in adults. So carcinosinum is one of the first great and obvious remedies for addressing the circumstances we're talking about. Calcarea carbonicum is another one of these remedies. Most of you are familiar with Calcarea carbonicum. Calc has a strong concerns with protection, with organization, both of the self and of others. Calc has a very deep need for stability and security against outside influences. They're hard workers, but not necessarily particularly ambitious. They do carry a large burden of responsibility and are the type of people who would sort of find themselves, like the carcinosinum patients, in a situation where they are taking care of a lot of people, where they're carrying the burden of the world and certainly the burden of the extended family on their shoulders, and sort of kind of just pushing through this. They're practical, economical, reliable people, and they tend to have, as you well know, a lot of fears of poverty. Fears of poverty are not really a strange fear to have in a situation in which there's an enormous drain on personal finances, because the financial planning that a family may have done earlier in their sort of history did not take into account the deep needs of generations, of multiple generations. Calc, which is, of course, from the oyster shell, tries to build a protective shell around themselves and around others. And that shell is intended to protect themselves from and to create stability, to create structure, and to protect people from their anxieties about money and about health primarily. And help people console themselves with eating sweets. And it doesn't take too much of an imagination to picture the woman caretaker in the middle of the sandwich generation wolfing down brownies at 10 a.m. for breakfast and looking for something to give themselves, sweeten their life, give themselves a little bit of a lift later on in the day. Sepia. So sepia is a remedy that most of you are familiar with, I'm assuming again. Sepia is, again, a remedy that we often know as a circumstantial remedy, as a remedy used for circumstantial or particular situational homeopathy. It is not uncommon when I have a child in my office and the mother comes in, and the mother is in much worse shape than the child because the mother is being pulled in a million directions. They have what may be a sick or a difficult child. They are trying to carry a job. They have other children they're taking care of. They may, like typical to the sandwich generation, have either siblings, parents, or grandparents who have health or financial issues that they're also covered, and they are just in a state of numbness. When I say to them the inevitable question of, if you could do anything, if you could forget your responsibilities, just tell me what you would do if you were given the opportunity, I inevitably get answers like, oh, I would just like run away to Greece and spend a month on an island without anybody there to take care of. Or I would just jump in my car and I'd take a drive and I wouldn't come back for like 3 days. So this feeling of wanting to detach themselves from family and community is such a typical sepia situation. Often I'll say to these mothers, just give yourself a dose of sepia, make an appointment, and I'll see you in a month. Because this is classic situational homeopathy or circumstantial homeopathy, where the circumstances are such that it's kind of clear that this remedy may be a very useful remedy. And that is exactly what we're talking about right here in the larger picture of circumstantial homeopathy. So just to take a little deeper look at sepia, sepia has this sense of stasis, of being stuck, of not knowing where to go. They have lax tissues in the musculature. We often see that expressed in bearing down sensations in the urogenital area. They have, as I discussed earlier, this indifference, a disconnectedness, a sluggishness, a dullness, irritability, depression, indifference, and a desire to detach themselves from family and community. Additional demands on them are often met with burden, with a feeling of burden and with anger. These women often lose their temper and they feel badly about it. They have a lot of guilt about that, but they're tearful and they're desperate. They weep a lot. They're better alone, and it's a perfect description of the state of many women caregivers in the midst of the sandwich generation. Aurum metallicum. I'm going to nip through aurum. Aurum is, as you well know, gold, and it's indicated for duty-bound, workaholic, industrious types who have a strong drive to be the best. They're ambitious. They're always busy. Their work is never complete or sufficient. They feel often like they're neglecting their duty. They have this anxiety of conscience in sort of repertory speak. They're oversensitive to contradiction, which results in explosive fits of anger and violence. And they're also oversensitive to the opinion of others. So you can see type A personality, somebody who is very driven and ambitious, who may or may not be working at a high level job, and is also trying to hold down an extended household and control that extended household, you can see them stuck in the middle, trying their hardest to be perfect at this nearly impossible Herculean task, and constantly driving to do it right, to be the best, to make it all work. And the whole thing just becoming a situation of hypersensitivity. Don't criticize me. I'm doing my best. I'm working my head off. I am constantly driving to make this thing work. They tend to represent as depressive, melancholic people, often with a suicidal depression. And they tend to have, gold has an affinity with the vascular system, the heart and the bones. Let's leave Urim and move on to cocculus. So cocculus is probably the best known remedy for patients who are caretakers, for the nursing the sick. And that, again, is a perfect depiction of our sandwich generation caretaker. Cocculus has the bad effects from nursing the sick. They're worse from a loss of sleep. They're not getting a lot of rest. They're working really hard. They don't have a lot of time. They have a lot of anxiety about their responsibilities, about their own health, as well as the health of others. The health of their loved ones is a huge part of concern about the health of their loved ones is a huge part of the picture of cocculus, as well as stress and grief and the symptoms that occur from that. Cocculus sees symptoms that affect the central nervous system. They have a weak and paralyzed feeling in the lower back, almost like they're collapsing under the strain and the stress of the burden of their responsibilities. Fossac. So phosphoric acidicum is a great remedy for people who exert themselves and push and then completely collapse. Harula described that a little bit earlier when she was describing what happens to these people. They just collapse. And that is a classic phosphoric acid response. The push, the drive, the striving, the effort, which is followed by exhaustion. They're hurried, they're industrious, and they feel like their feelings are unsuccessful. And then they have this fatigue and indifference. In the fatigue and indifference, these people often just cut themselves off. Often a good clue to a phosphoric acidicum case is when you say to a person who's in the state of collapse, what's going on, what's happening, they kind of roll their head away from you. They don't respond, not because they're rude, but because they simply don't even have the effort to answer the question. And there's this state of detachment from themselves, just being almost pulled into this cocoon when they absolutely cannot respond. The central delusion, and I discussed central delusion earlier, and don't have central delusions printed for most of these remedies, but the central delusion phosphoric acid is that I must care for others in order to be loved and accepted. And therefore, I must continually strive. I must continually work. I must continually push myself beyond reasonable boundaries. And again, in the broken down state, there's this brooding, a hopelessness, a despair, weakness, lack of energy, inability to express their needs, their desires, or their feelings in any real way. And obviously, there's a good phosphoricum element in some of these collapse remedies, because going from phosphoricum acidicum, we're going to caliphosphoricum, which is also a great remedy to look at for the circumstances and situations of people in the midst of the sandwich generation caretaker crunch. So as we know, remedies from the Kali family tend to take responsibility very, very seriously. They have a lot of feelings of duty, of drive, of responsibility. These people are often the salt of the earth. They're tremendously anxious for their children. They're apprehensive about their future. It can look a little bit like sepia insofar as the irritability, but the sense of duty and drive is really huge in Kali phosphoricum. They're independent people, but they still are supportive of their family. So they're able to balance those two needs a little bit better than sepia is. They're weak, they're exhausted, they're oversensitive. They have an enormous amount of both mental and physical prostration due to overwork and worry. They're irritable from their weakness and their exhaustion. She feels like she's losing control of her mind. She's depressed at night. And Kali phosphoricum patients are prone to headaches, as are sepia patients for that matter, and often have a foul perspiration. I think sometimes making a differential diagnosis between sepia and Kali phosphoricum can be challenging. I would say that sepia is much more concerned with the individual self, and Kali phosphoricum, even in the broken down state, the concern is much more about the family, their duty, and their responsibilities. And now I would like to turn our attention quickly to some other remedies that I think you should consider and you may not be as familiar with for the circumstances of the sandwich generation. I want to talk about lac del floratum, which is skim milk, ambergrissia, which is the ambergris from a sperm whale, vanilla, and then two remedies from the poales families. The poales are largely grasses, so I want to look at Triticum vulgaris and bambusa with you. So lac del floratum, which is, as I say, skim milk. The picture of lac del floratum is somebody who's very passive. They will not risk failure or danger or rejection. They never complain. They serve master. They serve their master, and they provide nourishment for mankind. But they live in constant fear. They will not express their needs, so they feel ignored, overlooked, and neglected. They feel resentful, but they cannot express it. They lose their identity. They bear a lot of suffering. They have a strong need to be accepted by community, but they live in this constant state of overwhelming chaos. They lack self-esteem. Most of their emotions are repressed or suppressed. Certainly their anger is suppressed, but also the ability to express their own needs for acknowledgement are deeply suppressed. These are people who need to look after other people, but they blame themselves for the problems around them. They cannot bear the thought of upsetting others. They have weak boundaries. They fear being trapped, and they avoid their feelings. So you can again picture the person in the middle of the sandwich generation who is meekly, passively going along with taking care of others, almost like the whole connection to the internal soul and their passion has been turned off. They're just going forward, going through the moves, sort of seething at a deep, deep, deep down inside. And this is not an uncommon or unusual reaction or way of presenting oneself given the circumstances. Ambergrissia. So ambergrissia is, as I mentioned, ambergris from a sperm whale. So we often think of ambergrissia as that remedy of great embarrassment and shyness, particularly for people who have enormous amount of hesitation to urinate or defecate in public restrooms for fear that somebody should hear them doing something as embarrassing as using a washroom. But there's a much larger picture to ambergrissia. So ambergrissia sperm whales are live in extended family herds, and they're known to take in other sperm whales that are in trouble and somehow lost their herd. So they have this affinity to the extended family, and they have a very strong attachment to their family, to the exclusion of others. They limit their interactions and are devastated by a loss within their immediate family. And again, you can see a sandwich generation almost putting the walls up and just creating this we're family and family alone against the rest of the world kind of scenario or situation. But it can be a very difficult situation, particularly if there's a loss within it. They have a lot of anxiety. They worry about everything, but they will not talk about it. They want to be left alone. They have a lot of nervous exhaustion, but they're over impressionable. They have a great weakness and lassitude. And I think an interesting symptom is the sleeplessness from business loss. And when you think about the fact that many of the people who are caring for others in this sandwich generation model have had to leave the business environment, had to leave their professional lives to take care of others, you can understand why this symptom would be of particularly great importance. Vanilla. So vanilla has a huge amount of importance on the family at expense of personal needs. They desire support or they provide support. They're busy as a bee. They're also highly allergic to bees, by the way. They desire order. They must put things into order. They're short-tempered. They scream. They control the household, but they're very easily enraged. They have this intense energy with a polarity of intense weakness. They're irritated, they're angry, they're overloaded, they feel like they're giving too much. They complain that they haven't been able to fulfill themselves. They've neglected their career due to familial obligations. They have a strong link to values of protective home and family. And the sort of area of physical pathology in vanilla is often the female reproductive system, as well as food. And we'll see this in the other remedies we're going to look at, that both the female reproductive system and food issues are high physical pathology themes in these remedies. I think you can look at this brief description of vanilla and see how clearly and how obviously this is a perfect example of the circumstances of a woman or caretaker in sandwich generation. And just rolling on to the poales family, which are the edible grains. The themes of the family of poales is themes of nutrition and nurturing, stability, relationship between the individual and the family. The family is the foundation of sustenance and existence. They either have a feeling of a lack of support from the family or a desire to support the family due to excessive concern about its well-being. Being at the center as the provider or recipient of nurturing, even to the extent of losing one's sense of selfhood. Wow, that sounds like the person in the middle of the character of the sandwich generation. There's sensations of being erect, of self-supporting, with the polarity of being weak and unstable. Again, a lovely metaphor for the person in the midst of the sandwich generation. Physically, the physical pathology of the poales family tends to digestion, metabolism, nervous system, balance issues, and impairment of sexual organs and hormonal systems. And let's take a quick look in our remaining, minute or so at both bambusa and triticum. Bambusa is bamboo. Bamboo presents as a remedy that's over-responsible, too much caring for the family. They carry such a huge burden of familial responsibility and that no one thinks they need to help. They look like they're doing it just fine, so why should anybody help them? They carry weight with much vigor until the point of collapse or they're reaching a crisis point. They feel unsupported, as though they have failed in this effort, this huge central task that's important to them. There's a strong mother-child bond in Bambusa. They feel depleted. They used to be strong, but they no longer are, and now they need support. And they have structured their lives in a way that people feel like they never need support, so they often don't get offered support or don't know how to ask for support. Physiologically, there's hormonal imbalance. There's a voracious appetite or lack of appetite, again, a polarity there. Exhaustion and back troubles. Back troubles is not, it's almost like they have the burden of responsibility on their shoulders, and then they collapse, and inevitably they have back troubles. And the very last remedy I want to discuss, and I thank you for bearing with us, I know we've gone a little bit over our time, is Triticum vulgare, which is wheat. And the themes of this remedy are those of maturity, balance, parenthood. The person needing this remedy dreams about rescuing her children in the death of her mother. Again, this is a great metaphor for the concerns and worries of a person caring for generations above and below them. Strong connections to the roots, to anxiety about family and loved ones. Too much generosity or tight-fistedness. They want a change in their life. They don't want to do the household work anymore. This speaks of sepia to a certain degree. They desire order. They program everything, but they disconnect emotionally. They feel obliged to comply to others' wishes. The remedy picture revolves around family and the ability to feel balanced. The issues of being uprooted from homeland, being displaced, or having a strong shift, again, women who have had to leave the workforce to take care of others. Pathologically, we see digestive pathology, hormonal pathology, such as irregular menses, and metabolic disorders. There's also foot pathology, eye symptoms, allergies, and water balance symptoms. And that was my very fast whiz through those remedies, and I'm going to just hand the baton over to Harula to say goodbye. I just want to say a quick thank you to Kartik and to all of you who have been with us. I'm happy to stay around and answer questions, and I think Harula has a little time to do that as well. So please use the chat box if you have any questions, and over to you, Harula.
I just wanted to thank everyone for attending as well. We do have time to answer questions, so please bring them on.
Somebody's asked about prescription.
Potencies?
Potency. Potency is always the $1 million question, isn't it? You know, potency is always a combination of a number of factors. One, your confidence in the remedy. Two, the vitality of the patient and the patient's symptom picture. And three, what you have in your drawer. So if you work with what you've got, if you've got all potencies and all remedies, I personally am not a high potency prescriber. So I personally tend to go with water dosing, lower potencies, 30 or so on a more frequent basis. But if you only have a 1M, pop in a 1M, one single dose, and give it a week or so and see how you go. So, you know, you work with what you've got. You can always safely try a lower potency remedy. I call them toe testers, just to see what the reaction, what the response might be. And if there's any indication of any improvement, you can at that point either increase frequency or go up in potency.
So I guess there aren't many. Yeah. You have an accelerated program as well, is it? For health professionals? Oh, is it? Okay. Just a minute. Yeah, I'm glad. Well, nothing. You just have to stay here. You just have to stay closer to your mouth. Just come a little closer to the mic. Yeah? You're all good. You're all good. Go on. So should we end this?
If there
I
aren't
don't
any
think there
questions,
are many questions. Yes, I don't think there are many questions. I think it was a very detailed talk, Beth, and I especially like the sepia examples that you gave. Beth, you've got your mic muted.
I do. Thank you, Kartik.
All right. Yeah, the sepia and the calcarb. Good one. I think you see most of them in that category, I think. A lot of sepia and a lot of calcarb.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, again, it depends a little bit on the reaction to the situation, but, and I'm hoping I made that clear that, you know, the situation is only part of the picture, the reaction's the other part, but I think that there's some really interesting, I really want to include some of the newer remedies or the less known remedies, because some of them I think are really significant, important, and super, super valuable for this sort of a situation.
Right. So anyway, thank you, Beth. Thank you, Harula, for this lovely webinar. And we hope to see you again next month.
Okay.
Yeah.
we'll
Thank you,
throw around
Kartik.
some ideas. Thank you so much, Kartik, for having us. Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
tuning in. And we'll do something super interesting next month.
All right
Okay.
then.
All right. Take care. Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you. Bye
We'll see you
bye.
soon.
Stay safe. Stay
You
safe.
You
too.
too.
Take care.